Thanks, guys, for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
I already know a number of you from Quaff and other events, but it's great to be here. So how many of you have made mead before? Oh, damn. Yeah, okay. And how many of you, well, I'll save that one. How do I click through, or do I need a... Perfect. Okay. All right. I'll blind Sean throughout the presentation. So, how long do I have? Well, that's dangerous. Don't say that. Oh. All right. Okay. All right. Because I can geek out about this stuff pretty well. So, someone cut me off if I'm going too long. All right, so a little bit about me. I co-own Lost Cause Meadery with my wife, Susanna, back there. And we've been, we started in 2017. We've won some medals at the Mazer Cup, and over 2019 and 2020, if you combine those years, we have the most medals in the world. So we're pretty proud of that, especially with the homebrew community, because that's where we started, and being able to learn from other home mead makers. I was at Quaff, but that kind of led me into becoming a BJCP mead judge, and the whole judging experience is what really made me a much better mead maker and kind of accelerated everything. And so the judging aspect of it is always been kind of near and dear to my heart. And rest have been doing some educational efforts and trying to, as best I can, help grow mead here in San Diego, understanding of mead making, and then, you know, around the country. So by the show of hands, I think everyone knows what mead is. I like to have this slide up because the thing that makes it something so amazing to me is how versatile it is. And so many people don't understand that versatility of mead. I'm guessing a lot of you do, but there's really no other alcohol where every step along the way you're presented with any option you want, right? And then if you just start with the base sugar ranges so much in terms of flavor and aroma, going from, you can get a super fruity honey, right? Super earthy, something that tastes like marshmallows, something that tastes like blackberries, something that tastes like, you know, jasmine flowers. And so just with the base honey, you really have a huge variety. And then from there, yeast selection, whatever you want. Fruits, spices, whatever you want. Are you going to carbonate it or not? Is it going to be super sweet or bone dry? All these things, there's no rules. So it's a lot of fun to do. And if you find yourself ever kind of making a certain style of mead or only understanding a certain style of mead, try and branch out, because there is really no end to what mead can be. And we try and do that at Lost Cause as best we can, kind of a range of styles and flavors and processes and everything. So I think everyone knows mead is old, but I like this slide because the earliest known fermentation, Jiahu location in China, they found traces of grapes, rice, and honey. And I just like to emphasize that because back in the day, there were no, not just obviously no style guidelines, but there was no beer versus wine versus mead, right? They took whatever fermented and threw it together and That was what was their alcohol. That is, I think, where a lot of the commercial industry will be going over the next 5 to 10 years. I think that the lines are already starting to blur. You're seeing a lot of brewers start to mess around with wine grapes and doing natural winemaking and carbonic maceration, and you'll see more and more of that. Same thing with winemakers brewing, and then mead. I mean, there are no rules, so we can kind of do anything we want, and it's braggots, it's piements with wine. So I encourage you, when you're making mead, to remember this. There's no rules, just like there wasn't before we kind of got really rigid with everything. Oh, okay. Well, got ahead of myself. So what makes it so amazing? I love the adventure of it. The intensity of flavor that you can get with mead is something that it's hard to match. And if you've been to Lost Cause, we have a few meads that are kind of trying to showcase that, like our Hoxa mead and a lot of our barrel-aged meads. There's really nothing where you can get the terroir like you can with mead. So I like to use the example of, remember the Super Bloom a couple of years ago, right? And so, all of those wildflowers that bloomed, a bunch of beekeepers brought their bees out. We collected a bunch of honey, and you had this honey that normally is not there. And so you're getting the terroir of this area that you only could get that season. So it's kind of like if you could have a vineyard, but then every year that vineyard would just kind of move somewhere else, and then, suddenly you're getting the terroir of this area rather than something that's permanent. And so it's a lot of fun. You can get it's hard to get a lot of it, but there's honeys that from every neighborhood in San Diego. And so you can get a honey that, this is North Park urban honey. This is what the terroir of North Park tastes like. Maybe won't make the best mead, but it's there. You can do it. You understand the concept. And then the versatility. So one myth I like to bust right off the bat is, especially with brewers, because I've heard this a lot, mead making is easy. So sounds like you guys all know this. A lot of you have made mead, but it really is easy to mix honey, water, and yeasts and nutrients together, right? So what would be your brew day is actually pretty short and sweet compared to brewing, but the work comes in after that, right? So mead is something you have to immediately babysit right away, and then for that first week. And if you don't know what you're doing that first week, that's where great mead is made, or disastrous mead is made. And so it's a little different in brewing in that the work is not so much up front as it is along the way. Other myth, mead needs to be aged at least 6 to 12 months before it's drinkable. I don't think this myth is out there that much anymore, but if this is something you believe, I promise you it's not true. Now, age can do wonders to certain meads, a lot of meads. Justin's Bochet, imagine aging that, on some medium plus toasted American oak, and coming back in 2 years, it's going to be even more. It was delicious, by the way, but age is going to treat that Bochet well, I would imagine. But you shouldn't need to age your mead to have it be delicious, and that's the whole point of what I try and teach when I'm talking about mead making is you need to learn how to make a very clean, delicious mead without off flavors right away, 3 to 4 weeks out of ferment. Then there's a lot you can do to it after that, and age can help, but you shouldn't need to rely on age to age out things like fusels and funky flavors and stuff. So what are the differences? Beer wort, A lot of nutrients. In fact, a lot of times it's all the nutrients that you need, right? A lot of times you guys aren't even thinking of nutrients when you're brewing, and if you are, it's just maybe a high gravity beer and you pitch it once and you're done. Not the case with mead. Lower gravity, pH. So you have a higher pH, but you also have buffering capabilities with beer wort, which is a big difference. And you'll notice that honey does not have those buffering capabilities. So you can see a pH drop happen really quick with mead, and that can lead to a stalled fermentation. Different sugar maltose, and that's very important to understand as we start talking about attenuation and why that does not apply. And then I say flavor aroma properties strong. What I mean by that is I think that when you make a so you ferment a beer, I think a lot of you guys will be able to pick out off flavors, but you ferment out a dry traditional mead, and the honey is so subtle, unless you're using like a really funky honey, that those flaws there is just nowhere to hide. I mean, to make a dry traditional with a light honey, you really have to understand every single step or just get lucky. Otherwise, there's nothing else, there's nothing else to hide behind. And so it does make it challenging. Mead muss, opposite of whatever, everything I talked about, and different sugars. So we're talking simple sugars, not complex sugars. So if mastering when we're talking about making a traditional mead, if brewing is like a walk in the park, or a jog through Rancho Santa Fe, making a traditional is doing that same jog on the hottest day of the year. And this is for the yeast, what I'm talking about, not like as brewers, but for the yeast. That same process on the hottest day of the year, you're hungover, you have a 800-pound pack on your back, and there's Raider fans throwing batteries at you the whole time. That is what the yeast are experiencing when they're going through a mead fermentation versus a beer fermentation. So you have to help them out, and that's the whole key to making great mead. Make the yeast happy, not too happy, right? You don't want to get them all jacked up and do a 50-yard or maybe a mile sprint, then they can't run anymore. But you need to keep them happy because they are going through all these challenges. So, and if anyone has questions along the way, just let me know. Raise your hand. First thing for brewers to understand is attenuation does not apply with mead, right? We're talking simple sugars. So there is no dry mead yeast. There is no sweet mead yeast. There is no attenuation that has anything to do with the yeast strain and when you're making mead. It'll ferment all of the sugars that you give it, except for, we'll skip down to the next one. So yeast can't stop, won't stop. So it will eat all the sugars unless you do one of two things. The yeast destroy their own environment, so they hit their alcohol tolerance, which is not the alcohol tolerance that the yeast manufacturer tells you it is, right? So, for example, we make or we use English ale yeast for all of our traditional meads. What are you guys familiar with the alcohol tolerance on English ale yeast, like White Labs 02? Anyone use it and know what usually the alcohol tolerance is? Yeah, it's supposed to be like 8 to 10. So we get it to 15, no problem. And the reason is it's a different environment, and you're keeping the yeast as healthy as possible on purpose when you're making mead. So you really have to ignore what the manufacturer says. Same thing with wine. So they either destroy their own environment, that will stop them, or they're stopped artificially with chemicals temperature, or you remove them from the equation, right? You filter them out. And so we'll come back to what that means, but those are the only ways that the yeast will stop. There's no complex sugars that are unfermentable that are going to be left over, or there's not enough to really keep it from going bone dry. Does that make sense? So let's talk about honey first, because that is the, that's the great thing about making mead. You want raw honey, and so you don't want anything that you're getting from supermarket, Vons, Costco, unless it says raw honey. If it does not say raw, then it's been pasteurized, right? It's been heated to a certain temperature. And with honey, you are losing so many good things when you heat it that high. We make sure no honey that we use is heated over 100 degrees, between 100 and 105. And you're safe anywhere below 110. I mean, in the hive, it gets up to 90, 95 degrees. So that's normal. But when you start to get above 110, you start to lose some of those really volatile aromatics that you paid a lot of money for. So never ever heat. If you are reading a recipe that says boil the honey or boil the mead must before you make the mead, that's an old recipe, and do not do that. You don't need to. Honey's antimicrobial. There's I've been doing this a while. I've never heard of anyone, never ran into an instance where there's, no matter what water you're using, an infected mead batch because of the, the honey. They didn't like pasteurize or sanitize the honey. That just doesn't happen. It's everything else along the way, but it's not the honey. Great places to go. Farmers markets around town. I don't spend too much time up in North County, so I don't know the farmers markets up here, but down south, Lily has Miklovich honey, which a lot of the breweries use. I think Stone uses them for their honey beers. There's Melges honey if you go to like the North Park farmers market. This is great local honey, just amazing local honey. If they made more, we would be, and we could afford it, we would be using that. We use local honey, but when I was doing it at the home scale, I just love the ability to go to a farmer's market, see if they could spare, 5 gallons and make that happen. So there's good honey here in San Diego. Who's used local honey? What kind of varietals have you used? Yeah. Do you remember what kind of honey? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
They make great orange, great avocado blossom honey. I think probably the best I've had in town is from Miklovich. A lot of other local honey. San Diego wildflower honey is always great because it's going to be a mixture of buckwheat, sage, citrus. It's a fantastic mix. So you have your orange. We have a lot of wild sage blossom honey, which is really nice. Our local buckwheat blossom honey is one of my favorite honeys in the world. If you've had buckwheat honey, a lot of people have had the really dark East Coast buckwheat honey, so that's the cultivated buckwheat, and that is like the barnyard funk wet horse blanket type honey. It's actually great if you know how to use it, but it's pretty intense. The buckwheat here is wild buckwheat, way more. It's still got like the caramel maltiness, really nice flavor without the funkiness. It's really nice. What's that? Yeah. It's and it ranges from season to season. location to location because it's wild. So depending on when they got the honey, it could be a little bit more sage than buckwheat. If you get it right when it's like probably 85-90% buckwheat, really malty sorghum, really dark kind of nice earthy flavors. So, oh yeah, that was the next thing. Other varietals, Tupelo, everyone's heard of. I'm not the biggest fan, but it is an amazing honey. It's really expensive right now. Meadow Foam, that's the honey that tastes like toasted marshmallows. If you guys haven't had it, it's just mind-blowing. If you get good Meadow Foam honey, you open up the jar, and it really is like vanilla and marshmallows. That's up from Oregon. And then if you haven't had clover honey from like the Dakotas or Montana, it's nothing like the clover honey you get in the store. It's just pure cinnamon, like apple pie. It's really nice. The other honey you'll find down here is avocado. And that can be pretty intense. It can be nice, almost like fig, earthy, a little bit of smoke. Sometimes it's a little too smoky, a little too funky. Where am I pointing this? Back there? Okay. So, did I? Yeah, okay. I went too far. So let's talk about yeast. When you're selecting a yeast, if the package on your yeast says Mead yeast, don't use that. Okay, I know it's counterintuitive, but a while ago, White Labs and some other manufacturers found some yeasts that actually struggled with mead, so they would stall out, and they're like, oh, this makes it a sweet mead, so we're going to call this a sweet mead yeast. It's like, well, no, that's actually it's the worst yeast for mead because it doesn't perform well, but some people have made great meads with the mead yeast, and so I don't want to say it's going to turn out bad. It won't. It's just a little harder to control. So these yeasts are a little more finicky than a lot of other yeasts that, with some practice, you'll have a lot better results with. So there is no mead yeast. There is just like technically, there's just there's Saccharomyces and there's different types of yeast, and over centuries, winemakers and brewers have said, oh, this strain has worked well with beer, and it does this, and it gives these phenolics and these esters. But it doesn't make it a beer yeast you have to use with beer. The yeast doesn't know, it doesn't care, just it wants sugar and will turn it into alcohol and CO2. So kind of a helpful thing is just to not look at anything when you're making mead as if you're using an ale yeast, it's not going to taste like beer. If you're using a wine yeast, it's not going to taste like wine. You have to understand what it is going to do, and then and there are some, like if you use a hef yeast, I mean, those are so expressive that if you get those same esters and phenolics, you may be reminded of a Hefeweizen. But most other yeasts that are a little less expressive are not, you can really use any of them and get some great results. We use ale yeast for all of our traditional meads, specifically English ale yeast, because I just love the subtle complexity, the subtle kind of flowery apple pear esters that we get. And we're lucky enough to have White Labs in town, and I've had a lot of success with liquid yeast when using traditionals. I'm in a weird minority. Most mead makers use wine yeast, dry wine yeast, and one, it's a lot cheaper. Two, most people don't have White Labs, next door, and wine yeasts are just the manufacturers for wine yeast are more used to dealing with nutrients, so they'll tell you, okay, this wine yeast is a low nutrient, a medium nutrient requiring, a high nutrient requiring strain. That's helpful to mead makers because we live and die by nutrients. So that's why a lot of mead makers will use wine yeast. Other things to consider: alcohol tolerance. Remember, you can't go by what the package says, but you can kind of get a good idea. So if it says this is a high ABV wine yeast, like it'll go up to 16%, you can have a good idea that, yeah, you can probably get it up to like 18%, whereas something that says this taps out at 14%, you know, like 71B, maybe it's not going to perform, it's not going to go as far. But don't design your recipe thinking that it will tap out right where the package says it will. Starting sugar content, some yeast will perform better if you're doing a high gravity mead, and some will struggle a bit more. Champagne yeasts do great with champagne yeasts do great with everything. I mean, they burn through it. They're not always going to give you the best mead result, but they'll chew through it. A lot of mead makers will use 71B for high gravities. If you are making something like a Polish style mead, where you're doing high gravity up in the 1.2 range and above, there's some yeasts that really work well with extremely high gravities, like Uvafirm 43. A lot of Polish mead makers will use that. Has anyone done a mead at 1.2? No? Has anyone done one at higher than 1.15? No. Give it a shot. It's a lot of fun. There's it's a way that a lot of mead makers, especially in the Midwest, are making their mead. Like Ken, who wrote the book that you guys raffled off, he's doing, you know, his gravities are 1.16 to 1.2 and above, and he's doing that so that you start with a lot of sugar, you let the yeast hit their alcohol tolerance, you end with a lot of sugar. That works really well, especially if you're using, like he does, really acidic fruits. Raspberry, blackberry, blackcurrant, stuff like that. You'd be surprised how high of residual sugar you end with that is needed to balance those really high acidic fruits. You'll drink it, it'll taste dry to you, and it's at like, you know, 1080 final gravity. So that sounds like a lot, but it's I promise you, and we have ones way higher than that, and I'll give them to brewers like, hey, guess where this is? Like, oh, I don't know, like 10, 12, you know, like or you know, something like that. And it's no, it's much higher, but that's the fun thing about mead. You can work with really high tannic fruit, really high acidic fruit. Now you don't have to. A lot of the people in San Diego making mead go a little lower in terms of ABV, gravity, everything. We're not quite as our style out here is a little different than the Midwest stuff. But when you're making something really high gravity, you can do it with mead because you control what the starting gravity is. It's really your honey to water ratio. Nutrient demands is another thing you got to think about. Again, if you're using wine yeast, it'll say low, medium, high. Scott Lab's fermentation handbook is your best friend when working with this. They have a whole section on what yeasts are, how much nutrients they need, and really what that is in terms of parts per million of yin, and so how much nutrients that you need to add to get there. Because again, it's a lot more it's a bigger thing in the wine world than it is beer world. White Labs has been telling me for years that they're going to publish their yeast strain nutrient requirements, and they still haven't. I do think they will eventually, especially now with the seltzer thing taken off, and everyone's like, okay, now I need nutrients. Like, so I think that's going to force them to do it. I have found most ale yeast to be the medium to high nutrient. So the other thing is you got to when you're working with nutrients, you have to understand it's not just what the strain needs, but what kind of fermentation environment are you giving it. So if you're doing like a warm fermentation and it's going to chew through 20 gravity points, every day for the first few days, you're going to actually need to go higher in your nutrients or just front load them. Otherwise, you're going to get sulfur and some off flavors. So it's the amount, but it's also when you add them. Potential pressure from other organisms, that just means especially if you're doing a melomel and you're using a lot of like fresh fruit in primary, there's a lot of wine yeasts that have a kill factor, which means that they will outcompete and destroy any other, including Saccharomyces that's in there. So wild yeast, anything like that. Some wine yeasts don't have that kill factor. Some of them do. Sometimes you'll want that just for peace of mind. And I talked about my rant for dry versus sweet mead yeast. No questions so far, huh? Yeah. Yeah? Oh, yeah. I mean, how many of you guys been to Golden Coast? Oh, everyone needs to go there. They specialize in sour meads where they are actually co-inoculating it with their own blend of wild yeasts and some bacteria. Maury, who's the head brewer here, started out as the head mead maker at Golden Coast a long time ago. I think a lot of you guys know that. And kind of kicked that off. They make amazing sour meads. They're one of the few in the country that does it. So, like, it's a great thing to have them here. There's not a lot of people that do it. It's tough to make like if you're making a natural wine. You can't really make a natural mead, or at least it's tougher because there's just not a lot of native yeasts on the honey. So you need to bring in something. But yes, Golden Coast is a good example. It's hard to say. When you're working with mead, you'll always need nutrient, and there are a lot of strains in the wine world that are low nutrient requiring, some that are even low nutrient, and they don't produce any sulfur off flavors even when they're stressed. So they're like the perfect, if you aren't going to add nutrients, those are the perfect ones to use. With wild yeast, it's hard to say. I don't know. It may depend on the strain of either the ingredients or your brew house, whatever it is, whatever you're using or inoculating it with. I don't know. I've only found though that the only low nutrient yeasts I've ever worked with successfully are the wine yeasts that have been bred or kind of picked out over centuries because they are low nutrient requiring. So I think it's hard to find that as a default. Okay. Pitch rate with dry wine yeast and ale yeast, 1 to 5 gallons per gallon or grams per gallon. Usually you're pitching a little more than you would. So whatever it says, if you're using wine yeast, whatever it says to pitch, go a little higher because, again, you're putting the yeast through a more stressful environment. Beer, whatever pitch calculator that you use for beer is perfect for mead. Put in the gravity and it'll tell you what to do. I used to use 2 packs of White Labs with a starter using honey as the fermentable in the starter, and keep that starter overnight and then pitch that into 5 gallons. That was my home mead making process. So I really like that if you're using liquid yeast. For dry yeast, you need to rehydrate. How many of you guys have used dry yeast and rehydrated it before? Okay, good. Everything you need to know about rehydrating dry yeast is in Scott Lab's Fermentation Handbook. It's a great resource. And you're basically using GoFirm. It's very important that you use the right nutrient when you're rehydrating, because some of the other nutrients, like diammonium phosphate, DAP, those are toxic to yeast during the rehydration period. So don't just use any nutrient to rehydrate. You'll be doing the opposite of what you want to do. So use GoFirm and just kind of follow the steps that Scott Labs tells you to follow. It's proven. Here's a little image of it in their handbook. A lot of dry ale yeast manufacturers will say, oh, you don't have to rehydrate anymore. You just pitch right on top. That may work for beer. It's not as successful with mead, again, because you are putting the yeast through a more stressful fermentation. So you need to do everything you can to help them along. And I just realized, so I brought mead to share. I think I should probably share it at some point. Okay, yeah. So I have, if anyone wants to help pour, I have 2 meads in there. One is the cans. We can start with that. That's kind of like a nice intro mead. And then we'll get to the next one, which is a traditional mead that we made with local honey. I'm hoping you guys have a wine opener. I always forget to bring one. Yeah, I did not bring a corkscrew. So let's start with the cans. This is called Deep Set. Right, Susanna? That's what we got? Okay. And that is a boysenberry strawberry mead. It's a session mead. So when you're talking mead, anything below like 8% is sessionable, which is not really a little different than beer, but most meads are 12 to 14 to 15%. So it's a session mead. It is made with wildflower honey and boysenberries and strawberries. This is what I like to call, it's not a serious mead. This is a fun kind of gateway mead. Really fruity. It's kind of semi-sweet to sweet, carbonated, approachable. A lot of the fruit was added in secondary. So this is a little different than a lot of the melomels we make. A lot of the melomels we make are a little more wine-like, still kind of serious, drink at room temp mead. This is just kind of a fun, fruity, approachable mead. So enjoy that, and then we'll get into the traditional, which is different. That's a mead maker's mead right there. All right, so yeasts need nutrients. I've talked a lot about that. Yeast assimilable nitrogen, or YAN, is extremely important to understanding how to make great mead. And you won't have a lab like we do to measure YAN for every mead that you make and measure it along the way. So you just gotta kind of go by what you think the strain needs, and then the yeast will tell you if they need more. So what is the off flavor that the yeast give if they're low on nutrient? Who knows? He's screaming out though, Justin. Yeah, sulfur. Sulfur. It's every time, and the good thing about that as an off flavor is it's super volatile. It will blow off if you feed it right away and then kind of take care of it from there if you catch it early on. The more you let sulfur stick around, the harder it's going to be to get out. And then you're going to have to start dealing with some of the stuff that winemakers use, like Regulus, or start throwing copper pennies in there or whatever to get the sulfur out. So as soon as you start smelling sulfur, if you do, it means it needs more nutrients. If you're getting sulfur at the end of a fermentation, that means you weren't paying attention and now it's too late to add nutrients, because you really only want to be adding nutrients in the first third of fermentation. Really, you're looking for 150 to 350 parts per million yan. So you can kind of go by, again, I don't want to get through all the numbers because this is just kind of a high-level presentation, and Scott Labs has everything you need, but Scott Labs also tell you, okay, DAP offers you this much yan, Ferment O offers you this much, and then just kind of go by what strain you're using to figure out how much you need to use. So there's a few different types of nutrients. DAP is inorganic nitrogen. Ferment O is organic nitrogen. Ferment K is a mix of the two. They are not the same. They don't do the same thing, and they're used for different purposes. So DAP is kind of like crack for a yeast, and Ferment O is like a salad, right? So you give the yeast some DAP, they're going to chew it all up, and they're going to want more. They're going to go crazy for a really short amount of time, and then they're going to run out of it. You give them Ferment O, it's used more efficiently. They're not going to go crazy. They would rather have DAP, but if you give them Ferment O, they're going to use it a little slower, more efficiently, and you can actually, it's why a lot of mead makers now are using all organic nutrients to get through a fermentation, especially at the home level. If you're only using ambient temperature to temp control your mead, when you're adding DAP to a fermentation, you're increasing activity rapidly. That means heat spikes. So the best you can do with ambient is temper that a little, but it's different than if you're, say, using a tank like I am that's glycol chilled, and you have a temp probe in the middle of it. So at the home level, you really need to be careful about heat spikes. Heat spikes will lead to fusels, especially in the first 36 hours. Fusels are what most people think mead tastes like that haven't had good mead. It's what bad mead tastes like. You guys know what fusels are. So now it doesn't mean DAP is bad. It just means that it has its time and place, and you really have to consider how you're going to use it and what your temp control situation is. So when we're measuring yan, DAP, let's say at a gram per gallon, is 50 parts per million yan. Ferment O is 10 parts per million yan, measurable, but it's 50 parts per million actual because the yeast is using it more efficiently. Does that make sense? So you can add 1/5 of the amount of Ferment O, or you can add the same amount of Ferment O and DAP. If you're measuring yan, the DAP will measure a lot higher, but but Ferment O is really giving you the same amount of yan. It's just not measurable because it goes further. Hope that made sense. There's different approaches. Some people do Ferment K and DAP, Ferment O and DAP, all Ferment K, all Ferment O. There's really no wrong or right. Ken, who makes some of the best mead in the world, he uses DAP and Ferment O and splits it up into 4 feedings. And you can't really argue with the meads he makes, so I can't say that DAP is not going to give you great mead. We use, for the most part, we use all organic, and so that's called, now there's something on the interwebs called TOSNA, T-O-S-N-A, Tailored Organic Stagger Nutrient Additions. Go there, they have a great calculator if you want to use that. A lot of mead makers nowadays are using all organic. So that's Ferment O. We did an experiment with White Labs. that was supposed to be presented in March 2020, and then the pandemic hit, so it actually never really got published other than on like a paywall site. And I think they did a YouTube. We did like a podcast on it. I wish it had been actual like published findings though. So what we found is that we did a bunch of different combinations of nutrients, and we did it at White Labs, so it was all in their little lab setup. We found that you got really different esters and fusels and higher alcohols from the inorganic and the organic nutrients. It wasn't always all bad or all good, but the one common thread was that if you used inorganic nutrients in the first 48 hours, you got a significant increase in higher alcohols. So it was more fusels. The favorite of the group was actually you start with organic nutrients, the first 2 feedings, and then the last 2 feedings you're going with a combination of inorganic and organic. That actually ended up being the favorite. So when I'm talking to, I think, yeah, Justin. DAP and Fermento, yeah. And Fermate K is, I don't know why I don't run into a lot of people that use it, but it's fantastic. It's just a blend of the two plus some added micronutrients. So a lot of people just use Fermate K, and there's nothing wrong with that. You get yan from fruit, right? You clearly get it from grain because you guys don't need to add nutrients when you're brewing. Most winemakers aren't adding nutrients unless they know that it's a grape that's going to be low in nitrogen. So you need to account for that. If you're making a melomel and you're doing, you know, a few pounds of fruit per gallon plus, a lot of mead makers will use a lot higher than that. Then you can kind of adjust your yan calculation. What a lot of people do is if you're using fruit, just cut it in half and see what happens. And you'll become familiar with it as you use the fruit. Does that make sense? Well, why don't we move on to the next mead, actually? And because I want to talk about that one. Any questions on the mead I poured? Chris? So it's a great question. I think we'll see if we get to it. Yeah, so that's a stabilized mead that we're adding fruit late to. And we're doing it because it's supposed to be a fruit-forward mead. We're not actually going for the fermented flavor of strawberry and boysenberry, which is fantastic, but we're going for the fresh fruit flavor. So we're adding it, but that can, I mean, you could ship it across the country. It's stable, and you clearly there's a lot of residual sugar in that mead, right? Oh, thank you. So, so yeah, it is stabilized. There's different ways to stabilize it. We are using a combination of, well, since this is a session mead, we can't use ABV, right? We can't use alcohol tolerance, so we're using sulfite and sorbate to stabilize, and I'll talk about how to do that. Before you guys get into this mead, let me introduce it. So this is a traditional mead made with local buckwheat honey and local avocado blossom honey. 2 funky honeys, right? So this is it's a weird traditional, pretty strong, aromatically pungent, maybe. I wanted to do this to show that you can use these honeys that people say, oh, you can't make a mead out of that honey. Like, that's just, avocado blossom is too weird. You can make a nice, and you can even make a traditional out of it if you know what you're doing. Yeah. Almond. Almond blossom honey? No, you can make great mead with, if you get true almond blossom honey. The problem with almond blossom is you guys have probably heard the whole country ships their bees out to California to pollinate the almonds, and they're trying to burn through so quickly that they're actually feeding the bees sugar water during that time. They're not even, giving them a chance. They're not making almond honey. The honey they're making is actually a lot of based on sugar water, not the almond blossom nectar. So if you do get true almond blossom honey, yeah, it can be bitter. But if you guys ever go to Italy, get your hands on some chestnut blossom honey. It is one of the best honeys in the world. It is amazing. It's dark, and I'd say it's like my dream room is, just like old leather, old dusty books, like mahogany, just like super. It's just an old weird tasting honey, and it's very bitter, right? But in Italy, they're used to it, and so they have all these foods that they use their chestnut blossom honey on, and it makes total sense. And it's a really cool honey. There's other honeys like that here, and so there's you can make great mead out of some of these interesting honeys if you know what you're doing. So this, what notes do you guys get from this? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't going for that one, but there's so this is also a mead that does better and better as it sits out. And the longer it sits out, the traditionals we make are kind of like that. The longer it opens up, I would decant this mead if you could. What other tasting notes? Anything that anyone's getting, good or bad? Herbal. Yep. Yeah. Just from the honey and oak. And it was cough syrup and brown sugar. Yeah. Okay. Anyone get coffee? Yeah. Eucalyptus. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not a mead for everyone, right? It's not traditional for everyone. This is but this is our way to kind of express the terroir of San Diego with two really intense local honeys. And this is a mead that will get much better with age. A lot of that will soften. You'll get more of kind of like the brown sugar caramel notes, all of that. Yeah. This is just oak. Yeah. And this was just oak cubes. So this didn't go in a barrel. If honestly is probably a touch over oaked for what I would have liked to do. But it'll just means it needs to age a little longer. So the smokiness is actually from the avocado blossom honey. Yeah. So if you're getting smoke, a lot of the weirdness in this mead is from the avocado blossom honey. So the Western buckwheat, that's going to bring the brown sugar, the caramel, some of the coffee, but any of the vanilla notes, all that. And then the avocado is going to bring the smoke, some of the coffee, some fig, dark fruit. And then some of the herbal notes as well. I would say probably all three: the oak, the avocado blossom honey, and the buckwheat. Yeah, because none of those are cinnamony on their own, but it's not the first time I've heard cinnamon for this one. So yeah, John. What's that? I think it'll, I think this will only get better with age. I just treat it like a wine. Yeah, cellar temp. It's just like wine. If you age it in the fridge, it's not going to age. If you age it at 75 degrees, it'll age just a little quicker and with less control than at cellar temp. But this will probably be fine. I mean, this is there's some alcohol in this, right, and some residual sugar. So this is going to hold up to a lot. It's going to be tough to beat this one up compared to your regular wine or beer that you would cellar. Makes sense. Aging mead is a weird topic because a lot of people want to know, like, okay, how do you age mead? Well, you know, what temp, all that. Mead is made with every different type of ingredient, and it's made different ABVs, different sweetness levels, different tannin levels, acid levels. All those things go into ageability. So kind of like wine, if you have a wine that is higher in acid and tannin, it's going to age better. Same with mead. If you have a wine that is residual sugar, it's going to age better. Well, same with mead. Higher in ABV, it's going to age better. Same with mead. So all those things can contribute to that. Any other questions? Yeah? Do we ferment it? Depends on the mead. This was fermented low 60s using English ale yeast. We've started fermenting our melomels at higher temps every time. So now we're up to like low 70s. I come from the beer brewing world, and so I'm used to high temps being kind of a bad thing for fermentation. But then you talk to a winemaker, and they're just like, yeah, you know, like it's 80 degrees. My cab is fermenting at, 80 degrees. It's great. It's extracting color and tannins and all those things. Like, oh my God, 80 degrees. Like, that's going to be a disaster. And then you realize everyone does that. So depends on the yeast strain you're using and what you're trying to accomplish. But I've started to creep up and been happy with the results with our melomels. I wouldn't do that with a traditional. Yeah. Yeah, I use wine yeast for our melomels that have fruit in primary. I'll use 71B, D21. If it's lighter fruit like peach or something, like QA23. Yeah. I just stick with the ale yeast for traditionals. Now you can make melomels with ale yeast. I just have liked the results with wine yeast better.
We have just like 5 or 10 minutes. 5 or 10 minutes?
5 or 10 minutes, okay. So if anyone has questions, just keep them coming, because that'll be the best way to get the most out of this. God, keep pointing the wrong direction. So stagger nutrient additions, this is the most important thing. What you're going to want to do, you're basically taking all of the yan that you need to supply and you're splitting it up. And you're doing that because if you, with beer wort, it has all the nutrients it needs up front. So it should, and that works for beer. But when you're supplying the nutrients artificially, that can lead to some bad outcomes with mead. So if you give the mead all the nutrients up front, they're going to use it up because it's accessible, especially if it's inorganic, and then you'll have a lot of activity, heat spikes, and then they'll actually slow down. They'll get hungry. They'll need more, so you actually have to add more nutrients than really what they needed. So the key is staggering, and a lot of people do it over 4 days. If you're making a traditional, I would add nutrients when you pitch. If it's a melomel, and again, there's yan coming from the fruit, you can wait a day, and most people will add nutrients on day 2. So then you're doing, if it's, let's say, a traditional, day 1, day 2, day 3, and then the 4th nutrient addition is at the 1/3 sugar break. So that's where the fermentation is 1/3 of the way through. If you're doing a melomel, same thing, day 2, day 3, day 4, and then the 1/3 sugar break, which is usually the next day or a few days after, unless you're fermenting at a really cool temp. Does that make sense? All right. 1/3 sugar break, all that means is when you've hit 1/3 of the way through your expected fermentation. So let's say you're using gravity, you have a 1.1 starting gravity. When you hit 1066, that's when you would add your final nutrient addition. There's a reason for that. One, the yeast need it then. Two, if you're using inorganic nitrogen, the yeast can't consume that after a certain ABV. I think it's like 7 or 8. Organic, they can consume later, but you get halfway through fermentation, they've used up most of the nitrogen they need, so then you're just adding nitrogen that's going to not be used up. And if you've ever smelled Fermento or any organic nutrients, they're not pleasant. It doesn't add a great flavor to your mead. So most of you guys have made mead, so I won't go through the basic equipment, but get one of these. And how many of you have used one of these without doing it slowly at first, and then you get this? If you haven't done that, you kind of have to do it to become a real mead maker. So don't worry. Everyone that's made mead at one point got mead on the ceiling of their home. I did too. And then you learn that you learn about nucleation points and science. A few other things, just to finish it up. I've just kind of focused on mostly on traditionals, but there's so much to learn about mead making, especially if you're making mellow mells. It's almost much more of a winemaking experience. pH drop, again, honey does not have good buffering capabilities, and depending on the yeast you use, the honey, especially fruit, you can see a pH drop very quickly. If it goes below 3, you're going to have trouble. It's going to stress the yeast. You're going to get a stalled fermentation. So you need to be watching that. I used to think that you had to degas every day for the first, all the way to the 1/3 sugar break. I think a lot of people still think that. You really don't. That was based on, I don't want to say faulty logic, but you do not need to degas in order to have a successful fermentation. It really is unnecessary. And degassing was kind of where you whip it up to get all of the CO2 out every day during the first week. Temperature, again, low end of the yeast tolerance. If you want to play it safe. And you guys know this for beer brewing, but you're going to get the fusels are created in the first 24 to 48 hours. So that is when your temp control matters. So with mead, it's even more so because you're feeding the yeast these nutrients. You're giving them activity that they're going to spike. That's when they create fusels. So you really have to pay attention. Those first temp control is really important the first 2 days. Additional resources. I'm a fan of the Modern Mead Makers group in Facebook, and gotmead.com has a newbie guide. Both of those sites have a lot of, not so much the discussion, but they have a files section. Look at the files section. There's great overviews of how to make mead. Stabilizing, I'll end with that because that's an important part of mead making. So you can ferment dry. The yeast have no more sugar to eat, so they're done. You can ferment dry and add sulfites and sorbate. So when you're doing that, you're going to stabilize the mead so that if you add anything after that, it will not re-ferment. You have to do them both together, okay? And those sulfite and sorbate, they do not, you can't just add those during fermentation and stop fermentation. That's not how it works. Fermentation has to be halted, then you add sulfite and sorbate, and then you're keeping, basically, it's a 1-2 punch. So sorbate is not allowing the yeast to repopulate. And sulfite is kind of it's just making it a more stressful environment. Winemakers use sulfite besides avoiding oxidation. They'll mix it on their grapes before they ferment in order to knock out any bacteria, wild yeast. Saccharomyces are built so that they can handle a good amount of sulfite, but it still makes it a little tougher for them. Cold crash and do that because, again, like I said, temperature. If you do stop fermentation, you'd either do it because it goes dry or you do it through a cold crashing. Then you add sulfite and sorbate. You can do that, and that's a great way to have residual sugar in a stabilized mead without going dry, right? You get to the sweetness you want, cold crash it, add your sulfite and sorbate. When it warms up, it's not going to re-ferment. Or you hit your alcohol tolerance. Or you filter, pasteurize. Don't do the cork and pray. It's bad. It's really bad with mead. My favorite resource for the numbers, how much to add of what, is actually Reddit. Just Google Reddit mead stabilization. Is a great page. It talks about, and the one thing when you're adding sulfites is you have to know the pH, because at pH 3.3, you'd only need to add, like 40 parts per million to stabilize something. Or actually probably lower, probably like 25. At pH 4.0, which you guys are used to with beer, it's like 160 parts per million. So the effectiveness of sulfite really decreases the higher the pH, so you really need to know what the pH is in order to make it work. And I think that's all my time. I got through a good amount. Any final questions on anything?
For cold crashing, do you ever get any like off flavors from the yeast doing that? Because I know like wine, you can get diacetyl from it Chardonnay? Is that common with meads then?
So theoretically it should, but I haven't found that in practice. As much as enough to that anyone would notice. And I get asked that by home brewers every time I mention that process. And I'm sure that if you measured it, it would be the case, that there's probably higher than if you let it ferment dry or, let the temp rise at the end. But I haven't found it to be an issue. Okay. Doesn't mean for your process that it won't be, but when we used to do that a lot. When we first started, we would cold crash, stabilize. We never had an issue with that. Okay.
Yeah. When barrel aging mead, can you barrel age that as long as like you could barrel age stouts, or because I've heard like honey or mead can pick up the oaky and wood flavors quicker?
No, so it all depends on the mead, right? That's kind of the answer to every mead question is,
like a
if it's a traditional mead, then depending on the honey, it could be lighter, and so be easy to over oak quicker than like a stout. But we make a lot of meads where, we have meads like our Hoxa that have sat in bourbon barrels for a year. And I'm just like, all right, let's get some bourbon character. They're just so intense because it's made with black currants and raspberries and vanilla and all that. It's just, with mead, you can go big. And when you go big, then it's actually, you're going to need more aging to get the oak, or if it's a spirit barrel, whatever, out of it. So it depends on the mead. But I would say if you're doing a traditional and it's a lighter honey, again, that's going to be more nuanced than like a stout. So you could need to age it like less.
It can go pretty, but you can go pretty long. Any preference of barrels like bourbon versus wine?
Both, all of them. Yeah, we've done bourbon barrels. They're great for mead. We've started doing a lot more wine barrels. They're great for mead. I mean, it depends on the mead you're putting in, but I don't think you can go wrong with either. With bourbon, you guys probably know this with beer, but you're gonna get you're gonna get 3 to 5 points of ABV increase. So you need to be ready for that. I've put in some meads. We did one mead where it went in pretty high, and the bourbon kicked it up, and it was like, oh, this is pretty intense. Like I didn't need those extra 4 ABV points, but yeah, wine is great. All types of spirits are great. New oak is great. I mean, we're doing stuff like Madeira barrels and cherry brandy barrels and mezcal barrels, and it all works.
Sorry for all my questions.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
Well, if that's the last question, I just want to say thank you very much to Billy. My goodness.
Thanks for having me. And tomorrow is the start. Well, actually, today was the start of National Honey Month. We've partnered with the National Honey Board. They selected us as a partner for this campaign they do every year, us and 4 other companies. So they're going to be in town tomorrow at our meadery down at Bay Park, and we're doing a honey tasting. So they're going to have honey varietals from all over the world, and then we're releasing a new traditional mead, which is not nearly as funky as that one. So it's much more approachable. But it's amazing. It's made with meadow foam, lemon blossom from Hawaii, and then local orange blossom. But the honey board will be there to do a honey tasting. So if you guys want to try some cool honeys, come down tomorrow. Otherwise, thanks for having me. And yeah, anytime you need a mead judge to taste your homemade mead, just stop by. I'm happy to do it.
Thank you so much.